What's going on, everybody? It's Dr. Eric Siddiqui here. I'm a board-certified family physician here in Canada, and before medical school, I was a full-time fitness professional for years and currently offer free lifestyle and exercise prescriptions to patients in my practice, in addition to the usual cradle-to-grave care that includes mental health concerns. And today I want to talk about autism spectrum disorder because it came up in the media over the weekend because allegedly there is an alternative health practitioner offering what's called microbiota transfer therapy. You can also describe it as fecal transplants. For this video, I'll simply call it MTT. Now, this story starts back in the year 2017 when one paper was published that showed some promise. Now, this paper was called Microbiota Transfer Therapy Alters Gut Ecosystem and Improves Gastrointestinal and Autism Symptoms, an open label study. And I use the word promise deliberately for a number of reasons, and this is another important lesson in skepticism. It's important to try and read beyond a title when you're looking at a paper, because often a paper, especially in preliminary or early research in an area, is flawed, or the authors come to quite soft conclusions at the end that you might miss by only simply reading the abstract. So if you look at the design of this paper from 2017, it was open label. It only included 18 children. That's it, with autism spectrum disorder. And the age range was also pretty limited. I think 7 to 16 years old only. And I think that was also because that was what was only approved for the study. They only wanted certain ages of kids approved for this early type of potential therapy. And the authors themselves admit that there were a lot of flaws in this study, which is quite appropriate. So near the end of the paper, they state, quote, "Although study observations were noteworthy, the current open label trial is not placebo-controlled, blinded, or randomized, as in, quote, an open label trial that is subject to placebo effects." So placebo could be playing a significant role in this paper because there's no control group, and it wasn't blinded, and it wasn't randomized. So later in the paper, I wasn't surprised to find that they do not recommend people jump to offering this as a definitive intervention for autism. In fact, they recommend the opposite. Quote, "A randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study is the next step to investigate the value of MTT in treating children with ASD and gastrointestinal problems." Now let's fast forward to 2019, where the same authors shared more long-term data from the people in the study, which again was somewhat promising in what they shared. However, very small group, no control group, definitely potential for placebo for playing a role. So the authors themselves again describe MTT this year as, quote, "A potential therapy to treat children with autism spectrum disorder who have GI problems and warrant a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial in the future." Preliminary research, it's often to help develop more questions that plant seeds for future larger trials with controls and more subjects, etc. But it certainly isn't a leap to clinical interventions, especially based on one study only on 18 children that was definitely flawed. Now, there's other papers published in the literature recently in the journal Nutrients, which is a fairly reputable journal. There's another paper published this past year called Autism Spectrum Disorders and the Gut Microbiota, and they concluded along similar lines. And this is a review of all of the evidence in the literature. Quote, "Well-designed, randomized, placebo-controlled clinical trials are required to validate the effectiveness of probiotics in the treatment of ASD and to identify the appropriate strains, dose, and timing of treatments." So this paper was around probiotics, but again talking about the gut microbiome and how we're still in the infancy stages for understanding its role in autism spectrum disorder, and far from ready, and we're premature to offer definitive interventions, in my opinion. There was another review published this year in Frontier Psychiatry, this one entitled Association Between Gut Microbiota and Autism Spectrum Disorder, a systematic review and meta-analysis. So again, this was a paper that pooled all of the available evidence, and they concluded this meta-analysis suggests an association between ASD and alteration of microbiota composition and warrants additional prospective cohort studies to evaluate the association of bacterial changes with ASD symptoms, which would provide further evidence for the precise microbiological treatment of ASD. Very soft language. Words like perhaps, future, more studies, with long lists of limitations in these initial studies, because that's what they are. Preliminary trials that help generate more questions and hypotheses that need answering before we start implementing this treatment potentially in children. So what are the take-home messages here? I think one of the important take-home messages is to take a step back and to go with your gut. If a treatment offered is described as not being approved in Canada or the United States and requires you to fly to a foreign country and on top of that, fork out at least $15,000 of your family's hard-earned money, be careful. Put on your skeptical hat. There's a very good chance that it may not be proven effective and potentially even worse for your child. I think another important point here is that if the researchers themselves are recommending against using this treatment currently in children and describe a significant need for future research, that supports your initial gut feeling when asked to fly to another country and fork out $15,000. I think some people also wonder, well, what's the harm? What's the harm? These are just fecal transplants, so they're benign, there's no risk involved. Well, I think there's potentially a lot of risk in my opinion. One of the risks is financial risk. $15,000 of your family's hard-earned money for an unproven treatment is legitimate risk. But there's also risk of physical harm with fecal transplants, and the FDA released a statement based on a paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine this year, where an unfortunate 73-year-old gentleman died as a result of a serious infection because of different strains of E. coli that he received during a fecal transplant clinical trial earlier this year. These trials are preliminary, and these interventions do not come without risk. And again, unfortunately, this 73-year-old gentleman died as a result of a significant infection from a fecal transplant. So we have to be careful and we have to be cautious and very slowly move forward based on the evidence we have, which at the present time is very, very preliminary. And I would argue only hypothesis generating at this time, and that's supported by the researchers. I noticed today that Canadian journalist Bethany Lindsay, who actually released this story yesterday, it looks like she's actually reached out to one of the study authors who responded to her based on their own research. They said, if it was my child, I wouldn't do it. So this is one of the authors of the papers published saying they themselves would not use this intervention at this point in time based on the state of the evidence. With fecal transplants in general, the evidence is really very early, like I'm saying, and that applies to other health conditions. And a lot of people were messaging me yesterday saying, but Dr. Siddiqui or Eric, there's studies showing that it's promising for obesity and inflammatory bowel disease. And you're right, you're absolutely right. There is a lot of initial evidence showing a lot of promise around fecal transplants for a number of conditions. Crohn's disease, there's famous rat studies in obesity where different size weight rats were given fecal transplants from other rats that increased their risk of weight gain. And again, the appropriate language is promising and not quite ready for prime time in humans, any human, especially high-risk children with autism spectrum disorder. So what's the take home today? I think there's a few really important take homes. And that's that as a parent, it's important to be skeptical of strong claims. especially strong claims that involve you spending thousands of dollars of your hard-earned money, traveling to other countries, and most importantly, potentially putting your child at risk of physical harm, in my opinion. We're all in this together. I appreciate your questions in the comments below. I hope this video was informative. If you liked it, hit the like button. It really makes a difference. And be sure to subscribe so you get notified every time I post a new video. We'll see you next time.